few years before this project came about, I don't know if you remember, there was a bushfire up at Eramboo Headland, where the bush hasn't actually burnt up there for a very, very long time. And a lot of the plants haven't regrown. There's a lot of regrowth in other species and smaller plants, but a lot of the Banksias, for example, haven't regrown. A lot of mainly on the eastern side, which got hit the heaviest by the fires. And so I was quite fascinated by the landscape that was created up there, where we lost all of the undergrowth and all of the top parts, and we lost all the canopy. Basically everything up there was gone, and we were left with sandy soil and rocks. And I'd never seen a landscape like that before. So when Sue and I got together and started talking about the cycles of the Banksias and the fire relationship that is part of it, it became very clear to me that this was something that we really should be working more with. So my fascination has been probably more of an experiential thing, and meeting Sue and getting an introduction into this environment from a science perspective has just opened my world to a completely different dialogue and a completely different environment and experience, and it's put so many nuances into every component of the pieces that I normally work with. So whether it's the water or the sun or the plants or the resprouting or cycles, all these things now play a very important component in each other's development. So so from my perspective, obviously the beauty of these things is the way they're drawn and the history of botanical drawings and the whole graphicness of this immediately recognizable landscape of plants and botany that Australia has, that to me can be very mechanical. If you look at the way that the plant is built, it's all very symmetrical, there's lots of little mechanical components that work together. And when I came up to Eramboo Headland originally, this was one of the first things I remember seeing, was the way that these Banksias, when they pop open, they reveal everything's black and burnt, and then you have these golden mouths that sort of sit and shine in the light and just pick up, it's almost like gold leafing. And I talked to Sue a fair bit about my fascination with that particular part of it, and that transition from fertility to complete destruction, and then somehow the bush just comes back very strongly. So one of the things that I was interested in was, how do we translate some of these cycles into the natural environment and how that is represented in a sculptural form, which is the medium that I wanted to take this with Sue. We talked about doing something that was a piece that you could move around and be more engaged with on a spatial level. And charcoal was the most obvious one for me. I've worked with charcoal a lot. I've picked up charcoal on the cliffs and used them off the branches and worked with them. So charcoal sort of became the end result of the fire and the cycle of destruction, and then somehow from that building out of those ashes into something that shows a beginning again. And the other thing was that we spent all this time walking around in the bush, and one of the discussions we had was that society and our human impact on the natural cycles is changing the way nature is adapting to things. So we can, like at Eramboo Headland, there's been no bushfires naturally allowed to happen. Therefore, it's completely burnt out. There's nothing left. When there is a fire, it's gone. Yet, if it had had a cycle maybe of more regularity, it probably just would have taken the edges off it, and it would have regrown and resprouted and all this. So we have an impact on these environments, whether we like it or not, whether we go into the discussion of backburning or not backburning and how frequently, all of those things play in. And living up here, and everyone who was here in the 90s when the big bushfires were here knows that we were impacted by those cycles as well. I remember very distinctly being down in Josh's house in Bayview and suddenly seeing flames coming up over Coringa Headland, and I'd never seen anything like it. It was terrifying to see these giant flames coming up in the sky and realising that it's probably a kilometre away, which means they're probably a few hundred metres high. And so that, the discussion that Sue sort of brought to the table with the beautiful seas that she's pointed out all over the ground, all over the bush that we walked that I've never seen before, all these things that I've never spotted. So my point was to how do we bring the community and the residential aspect into this natural cycle? And for me it was representing our physical presence, which is buildings, and for me the most simple form, which is clay. It's about reducing it back. So the charcoal is how this destruction sort of finishes, and the clay is kind of how we build our structure, the foundations that we're in. And out of this ash are these buildings that are part of this component, and within that structure we wanted to work with the idea of little sprouts growing from within all of this to show the rebirth of this sculptural piece. So the idea is that these buildings, small houses, will be placed, little blocks will be made out of clay, and then we're going to build a gigantic bonfire and basically fire these pieces in the bonfire, and then use the ashes to take into the studio and have these two components together. And Sue's somehow going to attempt, I don't know how she does it, but to grow all these little sprouts of banksias to sit and plant within this structure, so that we have these plants growing back again. So it's, for me it was about how do we conceptualize this, and simplify it, and bring it back to some very simple, tangible, readable components. And at the same time we were very conscious of the fact that Manly Regional Gallery has a lot of children and a lot of schools, a lot of educational programs running through it. So we wanted to have that discussion with the kids. We've got, Sue came up with a great idea of actually having some sprouts there that people can take home with themselves and kind of develop and look at this regrowth of their own. I know from my own kids that even the orange seed that we planted 4 years ago and now to plant like this is a great joy to our kids. So I think what we found when we went on our walk for the lab was we were immersed for 4 days in the bush with all of these scientists and artists who all carried an enormous amount of collective knowledge. And it was, for me anyway, at one point almost overwhelming. I wasn't sure what to do with it all because there was so much knowledge, there was so much new information, there was such a world that was opening. And yet taking the walk with Sue kind of brought it all back into looking at the specifics of these plants. What do they need? How do they grow? What is their pattern? How do they form themselves? And how are we impacting on that? And so the aim has been for us to try and somehow bring that back into this space.